When you look back, economic history is just this incredible, dramatic story. It's full of massive booms, even bigger busts, and these brilliant ideas that, well, just go terribly, terribly wrong. We're going to dive into this epic history of financial meltdowns, from the chaos of the French Revolution all the way to the dot-com bubble.
And it really begs the question that haunts pretty much every economist and investor out there. Why does this keep happening? We see the same patterns play out over and over again, but it feels like every single generation is totally convinced that nope, this time is different. They're in a new era where the old rules just don't apply. So is there some kind of predictable rhythm to all these disasters? Let's find out.
It turns out there kinda is. Almost every major crisis we're going to look at follows this classic four-act structure. First, you get a period of prosperity and cool new innovation that leads to a boom. Then, that boom turns into a speculative bust. That bust triggers widespread panic. And finally, the panic forces some kind of response that pretty much changes the rules of the game forever. Keep these four acts in mind.
Okay, so our story begins in an era that was just dominated by one single powerful idea: economic orthodoxy. This was a time of gold-backed money, of balanced budgets, and this really firm belief that government should, for the most part, just get out of the way.
And we get a really stark lesson right at the beginning of this period. So as Napoleon is marching across Europe, Britain and France choose totally opposite financial paths. Britain decides to tax its people and borrow money, building this rock-solid reputation for reliability. France, on the other hand, they just print money, these things called assignats, supposedly backed by confiscated church lands. The problem was they printed way too much of it, which led to hyperinflation and a total economic collapse that actually helped pave the way for Napoleon to seize power.
So the lesson everyone took from France's disaster really reinforced the dominant idea of the 19th century, the gold standard. Honestly, the best way to think of it is like a financial straitjacket. On the one hand, it provided incredible stability and discipline. But on the other hand, when a crisis hit, it severely restricted a government's ability to do anything, forcing them to just endure painful deflation and unemployment.
And yeah, a crisis did hit. The Panic of 1873 was arguably the first truly modern global meltdown. You had this huge speculative bubble in railroads. They were the hot tech of their day, and it burst in Vienna and New York. And because of the brand new telegraph, that panic spread almost instantly. The response? Well, guided by the gold standard, governments mostly just did nothing. They let weak banks and companies collapse in what, at the time, they called the Great Depression.
Just look at this number. That is the catastrophic drop in the U.S. stock market between its peak in 1929 and its bottom in 1932. This wasn't just a market crash. This was the complete and utter failure of that entire old orthodox system, 89%.
You see, the crash in '29 was really just the trigger. The real disaster was caused by all these deep underlying flaws in the system. You had wild speculation, factories churning out more stuff than people could possibly afford, literally thousands of weak little banks, and of course governments were still stuck in that gold standard straitjacket, which just made everything worse. Then to top it all off, they threw up trade barriers, and the whole world economy just ground to a halt.
The sheer scale of the Depression just shattered that old consensus. It sparked this intellectual civil war in economics. On one side, you had the old guard, guys like Hayek, who argued for austerity, let this system purge itself, liquidate everything. But on the other side, you had John Maynard Keynes, who argued the exact opposite. He said that in a deep depression, the government is the only one big enough to step in and spend money to save the economy from itself. And that debate, we're still having it today.
All right, so the devastation of the Great Depression and then World War II ushered in a completely new era. Armed with these new Keynesian ideas, governments were no longer just going to stand by and watch. This was the age of intervention. But it was about to face some entirely new kinds of crises. And the first big test was a monster that nobody had ever seen before: stagflation. I mean, according to all the economic theories of the day, this just wasn't supposed to happen. You could have high unemployment, or you could have high inflation, but you were not supposed to be able to have both at the same time. The 1970s, well, they proved the textbooks dead wrong. And the trigger for this whole economic nightmare was the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. It quadrupled the price of oil almost overnight. Can you imagine? It was this massive supply shock that sent the cost of literally everything soaring, which ground industrial economies to a halt and kicked off a whole decade of economic pain.
So where did all that new oil money go? Well, a lot of it got deposited in Western banks, who then turned around and eagerly lent it out. And who were the biggest customers? Latin American nations. Their total external debt just exploded from around $29 billion in 1970 to over $300 billion by 1982, a massive increase. But then, when the US jacked up its own interest rates to fight its inflation problem, that debt became completely impossible for those countries to repay. The crisis that followed forced an entire continent into this brutal decade of austerity, runaway inflation, and basically zero growth. It became known simply as the Lost Decade.
Just when the world kind of thought it had figured things out, a totally new kind of crisis erupted. In 1997, international investors just suddenly lost confidence in the so-called Asian tiger economies. And look at these numbers. The collapse was breathtakingly fast. Currencies that had been stable for years just evaporated, and the panic spread from one country to the next like a virus.
This quote from the economist Jeffrey Sachs just perfectly captures the psychology of what happened. He said, "The crisis was a classic bank run, but on a global scale. Investors were shouting fire in a crowded theater. Sure, there were some underlying weaknesses, but the crisis was supercharged by pure panic. Once a few big investors headed for the exit, everyone else stampeded, creating this self-fulfilling prophecy of collapse." Meanwhile, as the 90s roared to a close, the US was in the grip of its own speculative mania. The promise of the new internet economy fueled this absolutely staggering 400% rise in the tech-heavy NASDAQ index. It was an era of what Alan Greenspan called irrational exuberance, where you had companies with no profits, sometimes not even any revenue, that were worth billions of dollars.
And then, the party ended. The crash was just as dramatic as the climb. The NASDAQ collapsed by nearly 80%, wiping out an estimated $5 trillion in wealth. It was just a classic bubble, a really painful reminder that the old rules of profit and loss, they still applied, even in the new economy.
So after trekking through more than 200 years of these cycles, what's the ultimate lesson here? Well, it seems to be that our economic system doesn't just crash, it actually evolves through crashing.
You see, every single story we've looked at follows this exact pattern of evolution. A stable system, like the gold standard, creates a boom. That boom eventually reveals a fatal flaw, leading to a bust, like the Great Depression. The bust then sparks an ideological battle, Keynes versus Hayek, and then from that battle, a whole new system emerges, ready to start the cycle all over again.
And here's the great irony in this whole story. The very responses that are designed to solve one crisis often end up creating the perfect conditions for the next one. The super low interest rates that were used to clean up the dot-com bust, they helped inflate the housing bubble that followed. The deregulation of the 80s led to new kinds of risks in the 90s. It really is an unending cycle.
Which really leaves us with this final kind of unsettling question. Each crisis teaches us something new, right? It forces us to build better defenses, to create new tools. But are we actually getting smarter at managing the system as a whole? Or are we just getting more sophisticated at setting ourselves up for the next inevitable and probably completely unexpected kind of failure?